What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia,
autism spectrum,
ADHD,
Gifted,
dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hey there, welcome to episode 81. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. How many of you look to the future and think about your kids entering the real world after high school? Or maybe you have a child, I guess technically an adult, who has already left the house and is in college or the work world. Do you worry about them making it? Do you think about all of the things that you should have taught them, but they never came up? Today's guest, Amanda Morin, is the author of the new book, Adulting Made Easy: Things Someone Should Have Told You About Getting Your Grown-Up Act Together. Both a special education advocate and a parent of twice exceptional neurodivergent kids, she's sharing some great ideas about what our kids need to know and how we can help them get there. She's also sharing a sneak peek of one section of her book with us. You can find the link to it on the episode page of our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. If you haven't already followed us on social media, take a minute to link up with us. We are on Facebook and Instagram as Neurodiversity Podcast, and on Twitter, we're at NeurodiversePod. You can also join the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group on Facebook to connect with other parents and educators supporting neurodivergent kids. Up next,
I'm Amanda Morin, and I'm the author of Adulting Made Easy: Things Someone Should Have Told You About Getting Your Grown-Up Act Together. I'm also the parent of 3 kids, 2 of whom are twice exceptional and neurodiverse.
stay with us.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Practical intelligence and emotional intelligence. You also mentioned some brain training programs. Why are we clinging on to those concepts?
That's another book. I haven't written that book yet. I think one of the big reasons is that psychology has not done a very good job at disseminating this information. But I did a study where I examined intro to psychology textbooks, and over 3/4 of them had some of these misconceptions, and I quoted some of those in the book. If we can't even get our own textbooks right, how on earth should we expect lay people who haven't studied this for a living to get it right? And so I don't really blame society. I blame psychology more than anyone else.
That's episode 69. Look for it in your favorite podcast app.
Amanda Morin, one of our favorite guests, is back to talk to us today about what neurodivergent kids need to successfully grow into adulthood. Your new book, Amanda, is called Adulting Made Easy: Things Someone Should Have Told You About Getting Your Grown-Up Act Together. So welcome. We're so happy to have you back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
So one of the things that resonates with me about this book is that you talk about how it was created through the lens not only as a parent of 2 neurodivergent kids, but also someone who learned some of these lessons the hard way. So can you tell us about how you decided that this book, it just needed to be written?
I think there are multiple answers to that. And one of the answers to why this book needed to be written is in what the title didn't end up being. And the title was Adulting is Hard. And if you read the book, and you did, I totally bombed it. I just totally bombed it in my 20s and just had to start all over again in my 30s, figuring out how to be a successful adult. And what I realized is I now have 2 kids who are chronologically adults. And I say that because one's in her early 20s, one's 18. I have one who's still an adult in training at home. And I realized all of these lessons that I was trying to teach them, it was like I was trying to cram into this tiny amount of time all of the things that I wished I'd known when I was not doing this well. And what I realized was there are things we don't even think about that become skills that we use as adults daily that nobody teaches you, nobody talks about, and we just assume magically when you turn 18, you know how to do this. And to me, it was really an opportunity to say, we need to start teaching these explicitly. People need to know what goes into being an adult.
You know, it's interesting that you mention teaching explicitly, because I feel like that is something that so often gets overlooked. we expect kids to pick up on things, social cues, or just how to stay organized.
Yeah.
And some kids do, but I feel like a lot of kids don't, and especially our neurodivergent kids. But then we forget that sometimes we just need to step back and just lay it all out on the table.
Well, and literally, right? It occurred to me that budgeting, for example, budgeting is a thing that we often do behind the scenes, right? We don't want to talk about money. We don't want to talk about where it goes, how much you don't have, how much you do have. And I realized like that was going on totally behind the scenes. You know, my partner and I were having these conversations about how we're going to do this, how we're going to pay this, how we're going to make sure we have money for the activity that this kid is doing. And we were doing it on pencil and paper. He uses spreadsheets. I'm a pencil and paper kind of person. But we weren't doing it in front of the kids. And what I realized is literally we had to put it on the table. We had to show them, you know, even if you don't show them with numbers, you're showing them what goes into it. This like, we have this much money and we have these many things we have to pay for. And these are non-negotiables. And these are things that we could put off if we needed to. And even just showing that process was something that was going on behind the scenes. And I had to put it out front and start showing people in my house how we're making these decisions, you know. And of course, if you have kids, they're always saying like, well, how come you can't just go to the bank and get more money? And the answer is because it's not there, you know, sometimes, or because it's being saved for something more important that we will need. Like here in Maine, it's oil in the wintertime, right? That kind of thing. So we're putting it aside for those kinds of things. And so teaching explicitly is really about not just talking about it, but showing it too.
You know, it's interesting. We're friends from way back at this point. You know, you've been on the podcast a few times and we chat on Twitter and everything. But, you know, I feel like you're preaching to the choir a little bit because I'm currently in the process, and we talked a little bit about this, of drafting a book for parents of neurodivergent and twice exceptional kids. But one of the big premises in there is I'm going to lay out some skills specifically about how do you coach your child to build emotional regulation skills, build executive functioning skills. And so those are a bit more broad, but kind of aligned with what you're talking about. Yours, I feel like, is the very practical, like as they enter adulthood, how do you do these things?
And what you're talking about are the foundation skills that allow our neurodiverse kids to be able to do those more practical things, right? If you don't have emotional regulation, if you don't have organizational skills, you're not going to be able to figure out how to get your first apartment. You're not going to be able to deal with the disappointment of your first job interview that didn't go well. There's a practical component that needs those underpinnings. And so I think they dovetail really nicely.
How do you think transitioning to adulthood has changed? For example, what was different about how our parents entered the adult world, and then how we entered it, and then now compared to how our kids are entering adulthood?
Wow, that question is so complicated, and it's a good complicated. It's complicated, especially now that we're still in a pandemic, because I think the skills that our young adults need are really different than they were a year and a half ago. I think our parents jumped into a world where people got married younger, right? So they had a partner to help them figure it out. They jumped into a world where you often didn't change careers. So your career that you chose was your job path, and it was what you stuck with for an entire sort of lifetime. And that changed with our generation a little bit. I think we do more sort of, I wouldn't say job hopping, because that's not what I mean, but changing, right? Changing to really meet what our needs are at the time, whether it's, you know, financial needs or emotional needs or flexibility or those kinds of things. We don't always marry at like 18, although if, you know, in the book I talk about how the first time I married, I was 19. And my brain was not fully developed as an adult. So it was kind of not my best move, but I didn't know that at the time because I was a kid still. And now our kids are growing up in this world where they're entering into young adulthood, where they're, you know, social media is showing them what they think adulthood can look like, right? They have this sort of feeling of instant gratification that comes from when somebody likes something they posted, or that disappointment when somebody doesn't. And that falls into all of these sort of different categories. Did you get into the college you wanted to get into? Did you get a job? Like they're not as, I would say, emotionally prepared in some ways for adulthood as previous generations. And yet I also think they have some really adaptable skills that we didn't have. I love this generation. I think they're much more open-minded. I think that they have a lot of flexibility in thinking about how people belong in the world. They're, social warriors in the most amazing kind of ways. And those are skills that we didn't necessarily grow up with. And these are skills that are going to be really helpful to kids.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that right now, young adulthood is a really strange place to be because it's on pause, right? With the normal trajectory of finding a job, maybe finding a place to live with your friends or finding a place to go to, in a dorm may not be the same. So some of those skills that we are trying to teach young adults right now are basically like skills we have to teach ourselves too. How do you have an adult living in your home and you be a parent to an adult and let them be an adult in your home? That sounds so recursive, right? But it's really complex right now.
Yeah.
That was a very long-winded answer, but
No, I think that that's relevant. And you mentioned that you have one of your kiddos who's still at home with you, although maybe perhaps technically of adult age. So how are you navigating that?
Well, I actually don't at the moment. So I have an 11-year-old still at home.
Oh.
My 18-year-old has gone off to college this semester.
Maybe that's what I was thinking of.
But I think it's valid because, he's home over break. He's home over the summer. He's, and it's hard. It's really hard to switch. One day they turn 18 and they're in charge of everything. And you literally can't be in charge of it for them anymore. You can't make the phone calls. You can't ask the questions of the people outside of, I can't and wouldn't call his employer and say, hey, how's work going for him? I can't call his school and ask about his grades. I can't make a doctor's appointment for him. And yet he's living in my house over the break and he's still my child. So I have to figure out how to navigate that. And I think it's been bumpy because I think it is bumpy for a lot of parents. And he is also, he's one of my amazing neurodiverse kids who has this ability to really get to the point of things and not always see everybody else's perspective when he gets to his point. Right. So you combine that with like our newly minted adult and it's a challenge, and I've tried to sort of institute this, I will treat you as an adult as long as you act like an adult. But what does that mean? Right. Like I have to talk through with him, what is an adult, and it's things like you live in our home, but you have your room that you're responsible for. If you're going to be home for dinner, let us know. We're not going to assume that you're joining us, right? The things that we kind of assume that happens as our kids are, younger are things that we have to talk about out loud. Mm-hmm. And I think for some families, we're not there. But I think for some families, that includes things like, what are the rules around dating and having other people in your home overnight even, right? Like those kinds of things get really complicated. And uncomfortable. But those are those uncomfortable conversations that I think if you don't have them, that's when everything kind of implodes, right?
Exactly. You mentioned communicating with teachers and some of those things that parents often do, especially for our neurodivergent kids. And one of the things that I know I feel I am hyper aware of, both as a parent of neurodivergent kids and also as a mental health counselor, is this fine line and balancing act between this idea that our kids need to be able to fail in order to learn from those failures versus my child needs some support and some scaffolding. What advice do you have for parents to reconcile those two ideas?
I think they're not always reconcilable. I think it's such a good point, right? One of the things that I have been thinking a lot about, and it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about it lately, and I don't think I've talked about it, is that adulthood can look different for different young adults. And that if we don't stop thinking about this mold of what adulthood looks like, if we don't stop thinking, once you're out in the world, you are the one who has to talk to disability services. You are the one who has to make the phone call. we're setting kids up to fail in ways where they don't have a trampoline or a net underneath them. And I think for me, I've been thinking about what's that net? What's that trampoline? And one of the things I do in the book is even things as simple as scripts for how to make a phone call, right? What do you say when you call? Or I have a whole chapter on is it okay to text, email, or do you have to make a phone call? Because I think those are things that young adults struggle with. I struggle with it. I'm not a phone person. I struggle with it. I'm just going to be honest. If we're doing takeout, if I can't do it online, I'm going to ask somebody else to make the phone call, which is not my best adulting skill.
Or order from somewhere else.
Exactly, right? I will tell you, this is hilarious, but I might even stop in a parking lot and switch who's driving if I have to go through a drive-through. But that's an accommodation for me.
My executive producer and husband, Dave, over here is pointing at himself.
Because he does the same thing.
He hates, it's really just not even worth going through the drive-through, especially if we have the kids in the car. I'm like, just let me do it. It's fine.
That's so funny. So, we have to adjust what adulthood looks like for us. So I think it's about adjusting what it looks like. And there are ways to reconcile that in very simple ways where you can have your young adult signs releases so you can be part of those conversations if need be. Mm-hmm. A lot of times you can be in the room when somebody's making that phone call. And if they get stuck, you can write down on a piece of paper and hand it to them and say, here's what you need to say next. I think part of it is scaffolding before they become 18, mm-hmm. but it requires thinking about it at much younger ages. So it requires thinking about what's the end goal? What are the, even the basic things I want my child to be able to do when they enter adulthood? And how do I start teaching those earlier? I realized my 11-year-old, he does his own laundry. It's not always great, but he has to do his own laundry because that's a skill that I'm going to need him to learn starting now. Okay, you're going to do your laundry. Once he gets into middle school, we'll probably start teaching him to cook some basic meals, those kinds of things where you can put the foundation in place. And then those harder ones, those things that are much more difficult for our neurodivergent kids, I think are really often around communication, self-advocacy. And I talk about that as speaking up for yourself. And I think it doesn't just happen in workplaces. It doesn't just happen in school settings. It happens in social settings too. And the ability to set boundaries is huge, right? That's such a huge thing. One of the phrases that I've really embraced starting to talk to my own children about is the ability to say, I'm not doing this to you, I'm doing this for me when you're setting a boundary. And it's been super helpful for me to even reframe my own way of thinking that when you do something, it's not to somebody, it's for yourself. Mm-hmm. When you're setting boundaries.
You mentioned that you have a kiddo who is now just recently in college, okay. And that there have been a few things that you guys have talked about. Were there any hurdles that you weren't expecting other than, the obvious pandemic type hurdles?
That's so interesting. I think I have two. I have one who's now out of college and I have one who just entered college. So I've done this with two very different children. I use the word children as they are my children, even though I know they're young adults, right? In two different ways. And one really struggled with sort of decision making. And that was a head bump kind of moment where I had to say, you're going to have to make these decisions. I am your mother and I support you. And no matter what it is, you decide, but you have to make those decisions. I can't make them for you anymore. And those are life decisions, right? Or even small decisions like, do I take this bus or do I go this way? Or do I take a plane? Those kinds of things. With my son, who is now in college, he's his first year in college, I've had to let go of a lot of things. And I'm going to be honest that that's been harder for me. And as I mentioned, he has some very strong opinions and oftentimes rightfully so. I also have very strong opinions and maybe not as rightfully so. So I've had to let go of the mom perspective where you're you can't talk to me like that. He's not as aware of his tone of voice and how it comes across to people. And it's something I've tried to teach him over the years, but he's just not capable of learning it. And that's not for lack of trying. It is the way his brain is wired. And so I've had to let go of that and have to let go of saying you can't talk to me like that Because you know what? He probably talks to everybody in his life like that.
Yeah.
And maybe it's me who has to adjust to it. That has been incredibly difficult for me. I will just be 100% honest, because it does something inside of me as a mom.
Pushes your buttons.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I had a conversation with a client, a young woman who's in high school. She is autistic, very much a people pleaser. But we had this whole big conversation about how she really doesn't understand what the difference is between a demand and a request, because she is often accused of demanding things. And she's like, I am trying to say it in a way. And she's brilliant too. I just felt so much compassion for her and for her parents, who I think were trying to not like discipline or say, oh, you shouldn't talk this way. I think are probably trying to give her some good life skills.
Right.
So she's constantly thinking over and over and over to herself, how is this going to be perceived? Is this the way I want it to be perceived? It was such a good glimpse for me into the effort that goes into some of that for our kids, and how sometimes we as parents, and sometimes just the world in general, is very intolerant.
Yes.
Of those types of things.
That's very similar to what I'm talking about. And my son is also autistic, and proudly so. And I have had to let go of that particular one. And I, it's not, I mean, some of it's about pushing my buttons because I'm his mother. And some of it's about, I worry and I want to protect him from the world, right? I don't want the rest of the world to see this as a demand when it's a request, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, what I had to do was sort of like figure out whether or not I was going to explain to him why it came across that way to me, mm-hmm. as opposed to telling him not to talk like that, because he doesn't know. He doesn't know. And I don't want him to have that constant cognitive load of, how is this coming across to him? I want him to be able to communicate with other people without it being something that he's thinking about in other ways too, right? Like I want him to be able to have conversations where he's not thinking about like, how does this sound? Mm-hmm. I want him to be able to just enjoy conversations. And that way I think has been really good for him, even in COVID times, to go off to college, because he's navigating those things on his own. And, he calls home, and it sounds, he has things to complain about because he's 18 and he has things to complain about, but it sounds like he's really doing a good job of finding friends who are accepting him for who he is. And to me, that's a moment where I think, okay, the glimpse of this young adult that I see is not what the rest of the world sees. And I think that that's a good lesson for us as parents, is to remember that what we worry about isn't what the rest of the world sees. They see the young adult in front of them and not the history behind it.
You mentioned also those scripting for the phone calls.
Yeah.
And I think that that's sometimes a way that I kind of support some of those kids. Like, let's just find a way that you could say this. A slight turn of phrase, it's just hard. It's just hard to be in the world when you're a neurodivergent person, I think.
When I started out as an adult, I felt like I was a weird sociologist sort of exploring this new planet. I didn't understand all of these sort of social norms, and I bumbled my way through a lot of it. I really, really did. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is to show people that you can bumble through it and still be okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I loved about writing this book is I could be authentically me. And there were stories in there of me just being such a dunderhead, where I just didn't see what was in front of me and didn't do what would have been the most appropriate adult move. But I tell those stories not as a way to say, look at me, I totally failed, but to say, look at me, I didn't do this well, and I'm still okay. I'm out here. You're going to fail too. But you can come back from it.
Yeah, it's a learning experience.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more just about what sorts of things are in your book. You mentioned budgeting, you mentioned making a phone call. Is there a certain piece of it that you feel like will really resonate with young adults? Things maybe that either they or their parents just hadn't even really thought of?
I think there are a couple of them. The one about budgeting, one of the things that I did in that chapter around budgeting was break down what I called the hidden costs of adulting, right? And there are the things that you don't think about putting into a budget regularly, like your car registration comes up every year. So how are you saving for that if you're going out with your friends and you haven't budgeted for the meal, which hopefully will happen again
someday,
how does that fit into your budget, right? So I think that was a really important part. There's a piece in there, like just as simple as putting a first aid kit together. What do you need to have in the house? Benadryl for allergic reactions and pain relievers and Band-Aids, because I don't know about you, but finding a Band-Aid is always such a trial. I don't know where they all go. So I have extra. I think they're at the bottom of my backpack somewhere usually, but, and then there's an entire chapter on like social media. And I think that one's really important because it's not about not using social media. It's about realizing that as you become an adult, the people who are looking at your social media may also be the people who help you in your future, who advance your future. So are there things that you have on there from when you were 13 that you don't want on there anymore? Are there ways that you want to express yourself that an employer may not be particularly happy with? And do you need to set up another account for that, right? Like, so there's a whole lot of things around social media and communication, and even just like thinking through what might happen if you make an offhand comment that offends somebody. I mean, we've all seen like the Twitter things that get out of hand where you just make a comment where you thought it was nothing and then like it blows up. And you have this like, oh, what did I do? I don't know how that happened. So that's in there too. And then there's things about like picking roommates, right? Or finding your first apartment and the questions to ask, the things to think through. You know, are utilities included? Is the heat included? What will I have to pay on my own? You know, what does it mean to pick a roommate when you don't know them, right? What do you need to do? Even where do you meet them, right? Do you bring them to the apartment? Probably not. You probably meet them for coffee. And things like roommate agreements, which I laugh about because Big Bang Theory is one of my favorite TV shows, and they talk a lot about having a roommate agreement. But I actually think there's value to a roommate agreement. The things that you need to lay out front, you know, if you're splitting the rent, are you paying your roommate your half of the rent and trusting that it's getting to the landlord? Or do you both want to write separate checks or Venmo separately to the landlord? Those simple things that as adults who have been in situations where maybe we've been burned before, we can at least impart that advice and say, you know, this is something you actually want to consider. I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but consider it at least.
Depending on your family dynamics and your relationship with your parents, these might be many things that your parents would tell you anyway. But if you see them in a book, then they must be real.
It's so funny that you say that. Anything that comes up in our house lately with the older two, one of them looks at me, rolls her eyes and says, I bet this is in your book. Like,
I love that.
And sometimes I want to be like, on page 72, paragraph 3.
That's funny. No, but I mean, I think that's true. I often tell parents with my clients, you know, I say, well, I'm really just going to tell them the same thing that you tell them, but it's coming from me. So it somehow has more weight.
I need a copy of it that doesn't have my name on the title that I can give to my own kids.
Right.
I did vet it with them, and that was super helpful. You know, when I was doing the outline, I provided it to both of them and said, what am I missing that you wish you'd learned, or what shouldn't be in here? And of course, both of them were like, you never taught me that one, you know? And I was like, okay, well, there's something I got to get on right now is teaching you how to sew on a button.
That's an interesting place for self-reflection as authors writing books for other kids and parents. Is like, well, practice what you preach, right? Yes, I do all of this.
Right.
Imperfectly. It's okay. We are imperfect as parents, and, you know, but this is another way to kind of support our kids.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, if you were talking to a neurodivergent young adult, maybe not your own child, maybe a different child, but perhaps your own, but you really wanted to just give them one piece of advice or one piece of encouragement, what would you say to them?
I would tell them they're going to fail, and that's okay. Because once you fail, you have learned a lesson, and you can move on and try it again a different way. It is not the end of the world.
I think that's so important for our kids to hear. Thank you, Amanda, for your time, and we'll look forward to having you back again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We've all learned some hard lessons while growing up. Hidden rules and expectations that weren't always obvious. Especially for some of us who are neurodiverse, lessons that seem simple to everyone else, we somehow missed. Amanda's book is a perfect example of one of my core principles for parenting. Never forget to explicitly teach the things that seem obvious. Especially if you are the parent or teacher of a bright kid, sometimes we're shocked that kids don't just figure things out. Step by step is how we all learn, and occasionally we all need tips about how to navigate new situations. I'm Emily Kircher Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thank you to Amanda Morin for the interesting perspective about adulting, and don't forget to download the free excerpt of her book, Adulting Made Easy, on the episode 81 page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. While you're there, you can click support on the navigation menu to become a Patreon patron and help defray the cost of producing our podcast. A $2 membership helps more than you know. This episode was produced and edited by me, Dave Morris, and for Emily Kircher Morris, thanks for listening. Stay safe. Stay healthy. See you next time. This is a production of Morris Creative Services.